The house was quiet in the way only a troubled home can be, lights half on, televisions buzzing in empty rooms, toys scattered across a floor no one had cleaned in days. It was the kind of silence that feels held together by frayed nerves and rising anger. Hours before the violence, neighbors later told investigators they heard shouting drifting from the small Escondido home, a familiar sound in a household where arguments had become a nightly ritual. What they could not hear were the final pieces snapping into place inside a mother pushed past her breaking point. According to police reports, the day had been a spiral. Financial strain weighed heavily. Her relationship with her boyfriend had devolved into fights, marked by accusations, jealousy, and drinking. Friends would later tell detectives that she had spent that afternoon moving between bars and home, each stop adding fuel to emotions already running hot. Officers who reconstructed the timeline said she returned to the house in a storm of frustration, pacing, drinking, slamming doors while her 4 young sons tried to stay out of her path. As night fell, anger turned into something darker. Investigators believe the argument with her boyfriend triggered a cascade of resentment. According to court testimony, she viewed the children as extensions of everything collapsing around her. The failed relationship, the unpaid bills, the sense that her life was slipping out of control. Prosecutors later described it as a rage-fueled implosion, a psychological break that moved with chilling speed. What happened next unfolded within minutes. Forensic analysts would later estimate the sequence based on shell casings, bullet paths, and the positions of the boys' bodies. They believed she retrieved a firearm, loaded it with methodical precision, and moved room to room. The sons aged 14, 7, 6, and 4 never had a chance to react, let alone understand what was happening. The home that once held their drawings and school backpacks became the setting for an irreversible act. When officers arrived after a 911 call placed by Eubanks herself, they found her sitting on the floor, injured by what investigators later described as a self-inflicted wound. Her voice on the call had been slurred, detached, and flat. Inside, responders discovered all 4 boys. The details, though softened in official reports, were devastating even to seasoned detectives. One officer later told a reporter it was a scene no one forgets. Eubanks offered a version of events that painted herself as pushed to the edge by betrayal and emotional collapse. She repeated claims of depression, heartbreak, and drinking. But as officers began documenting the house, noting the order of the shots and the lack of any defensive chaos, they realized her explanation could not stand on its own. The firearm was found deliberately placed. The sequence was too controlled. The boys appeared to have been attacked where they stood or slept, not during an out-of-control struggle. Investigators left the home with a growing certainty. The story she had offered was not the truth. The events of the night were not spontaneous, not chaotic, not accidental. They showed intention, and that intention would soon become the centerpiece of one of California's most haunting murder cases. Detectives stepped back into the house the next morning with fresh eyes, moving slowly through each room as the sun lit the carpet where their flashlights had swept hours earlier. What had looked chaotic in the dark now revealed a disturbing level of control. Shell casings formed a quiet trail across the floor, each one marking a deliberate action. The boys had been found in separate areas of the home, and forensic mapping showed no signs of a frantic struggle. No overturned furniture, no defensive movements, no forced entry. Everything pointed to an attack carried out with intention rather than impulse. Ballistics experts began their reconstruction. They determined the weapon had been fired from close range and reloaded with calm precision. Each shot showed consistency in angle and placement. This was not random, investigators noted, but sequential. One child had been attacked while lying on a bed. Another appeared to have been surprised while sitting on the floor. 2 were positioned near doorways, as if they had moved toward the sound without realizing the danger. Digital timestamps, on the 911 recording captured how little time had passed between the final shot and her call for help. A detail prosecutors would later describe as chilling. When questioned at the hospital, Eubanks repeated her claims of despair, heartbreak, and intoxication. She spoke of a failed relationship, of betrayal, of feeling overwhelmed. But detectives observed how her statements drifted, changed, and doubled back. According to interrogation transcripts, she blamed her boyfriend, then the boys, then herself, but in ways that felt carefully shaped to evoke sympathy. Toxicology tests showed alcohol in her system, but not enough to explain the controlled nature of the shootings. Investigators pressed her on the sequence of events, and each time her answers produced new contradictions. Prosecutors built their case around those contradictions. In preliminary hearings, they argued that the killings stemmed from what they called a calculating act of revenge. They pointed to her written notes found at the scene, letters filled with accusations and resentment, and to statements she made to friends days earlier about feeling deserted. According to court records, the prosecution emphasized the calm reload, the targeted sequence, and her steady movements through the home, arguing these actions demonstrated full awareness and purpose. The defense presented a different narrative. They claimed she had been in a dissociative state, driven by emotional collapse and impaired by alcohol, unable to fully comprehend her actions. Testimony from mental health experts described her as depressed, unstable, and overwhelmed. Her attorneys argued that years of turmoil had culminated in a moment of catastrophic breakdown rather than premeditated murder. But the prosecution countered that the level of control documented by forensics undermined any claim of diminished capacity. The jury listened to days of painful testimony. Neighbors recalling the boys playing in the yard, teachers describing their personalities, and officers detailing what they encountered that night. One detective broke down briefly when describing the youngest child's bedroom. Even the courtroom stenographer reportedly paused during portions of the victim's statements from relatives who asked how a mother could turn her home into a place of violence. After deliberations, the jury returned with 4 convictions for first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued that the calculated nature of the killings warranted the harshest possible sentence. The defense pleaded for life without parole, describing her as a woman crushed by emotional despair. But the jury recommended death, and the judge affirmed it, calling the case one of incomprehensible cruelty. Outside the courthouse, a memorial of candles, teddy bears, and handwritten notes grew along the sidewalk. Neighbors, strangers, and classmates gathered quietly, leaving drawings the boys had once made in school and messages that read simply, "We won't forget you." The night felt ordinary until the screams split the quiet open. A single-story home in Rowlett, Texas, suddenly erupted with panic. A mother yelling for help, the sound of footsteps on tile, and then a frantic 911 call that investigators would replay for years. According to dispatch logs, her voice shook but carried an eerie steadiness as she reported that an intruder had entered the house and attacked her 2 young sons. She said she had fought him off, said he had fled through the garage, said everything had happened in seconds. But as the recording played on, detectives later noted how her tone swung between frantic and oddly controlled, as if 2 emotions were fighting for dominance. Responders arrived to a scene that was both chaotic and strangely organized. Blood streaked the living room carpet. A vacuum cleaner lay overturned. A lamp was tipped on its side. But seasoned officers felt something was wrong. Certain objects seemed placed rather than knocked over. The break-in point, the utility room window, showed dust undisturbed. The mulch outside held no clear footprints, and the fibers torn from the window screen appeared cut, not ripped. Detectives began wondering whether this was truly a struggle or the simulation of one. Inside, the wounds told a sharper story. The older boy was already gone when paramedics reached him. His younger brother lay gravely injured. Dali herself had a superficial neck wound serious enough to look dramatic in photographs, but, according to surgeons later consulted by police, positioned in a way that suggested caution rather than desperation. As officers moved through the house, they noticed blood patterns that contradicted her account. Cast-off arcs and smeared trails led back to the kitchen sink, where forensic luminol later revealed diluted blood, as if someone had paused mid-crisis to wash their hands. Within days, the case shifted from a terrifying home invasion to a fragile, unsettling puzzle. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, broadcasting updates as investigators quietly reassembled the night frame by frame. While the public waited for news of the supposed intruder, crime scene analysts were mapping stains, documenting angles, and comparing her statements to the physical evidence. Each new detail raised more questions. Why weren't the boy's wounds consistent with a fleeing attacker? Why was her story shifting between interviews? Why did the fibers on the knife from the routier kitchen match the screen that had been cut? Then came the footage that stunned the nation. 12 days after the deaths, family and friends gathered at the cemetery to honor what would have been the boys' birthdays. During the solemn service, cameras caught a moment where Dali laughed, chewed gum, and sprayed silly string over the graves with a kind of bright, jarring cheer. It lasted seconds, but it changed everything. Prosecutors would later replay the clip in court as a reflection of demeanor, while supporters argued it captured a grieving mother trying to honor her son's happiness. But for many, the contrast between the brutality of the crime and the upbeat celebration felt impossible to reconcile. Behind the scenes, forensic discrepancies multiplied. Patterns of blood flow on her nightshirt, the limited signs of intrusion, the tidy staging. Even the timing of the knife wounds suggested she would have had to move through the house with remarkable calm after the attack. Detectives did not yet have enough to build a definitive narrative, but the pieces were turning toward her, slowly and unmistakably. What had begun as a horrifying mystery was now tightening around one central question. Was the mother's account true, or was the entire scene something far more orchestrated than the frantic call had suggested? By the time the case reached the courtroom, the nation already felt divided. Some saw a grieving mother caught in a nightmare, while others saw a woman whose explanations unraveled with every forensic slide projected on the screen. The trial opened with a stark contrast. The defense framed her as a loving parent battling postpartum distress, while prosecutors described an elaborate staging meant to hide a calculated attack. Both sides agreed on only one thing: what happened in that Rowlett living room was nothing short of catastrophic. Prosecutors began by calling blood-stain pattern analysts to the stand. They walked the jury through diagrams, showing droplets, angles, and velocity, pointing out how the direction of the cast-off matched someone standing above the boys, rather than an intruder moving across the room. According to their testimony, the distribution on Dali's nightshirt suggested she had been close to the children at the moment of the attack. They described the diluted stains in the kitchen sink as evidence of cleanup, not panic. Every diagram, every chart, chipped away at the idea of a stranger slipping into the home under cover of darkness. The defense countered with its own experts, arguing the scene had become chaotic when she discovered her sons wounded. They said she moved frantically between the boys, picking them up, trying to comfort them, and attempting to stop the bleeding. They insisted that in such a moment, blood transfer would be unpredictable. To explain the inconsistencies in her statements, they pointed to exhaustion, trauma, and the fog of someone who had nearly died herself. They introduced testimony about postpartum depression, describing a woman overwhelmed by emotional turmoil in the weeks leading up to the attack. But prosecutors pushed back harder. They suggested motive in small, carefully chosen details: mounting debt, a strained marriage, and frustrations she voiced in private. They replayed the silly string video in court, a moment the public had already dissected on television. Prosecutors framed it not as a grieving mother celebrating her son's birthdays, but as a glimpse into a disturbing emotional disconnect. The defense argued it was taken out of context, noting that moments before, a somber prayer had been said. But the footage hung in the air, like a shadow the defense could not fully dispel. Then came the knife. A forensic expert testified that fibers from the cut window screen matched the bread knife found in the Routier kitchen. This singular detail struck the courtroom hard. If the same knife had been used to stage the break-in, it suggested premeditation rather than panic. The defense challenged the testing method, but the visual match presented to the jury left an impact that was difficult to shake. Through it all, Darlie maintained her innocence. She took the stand to describe the night in halting detail, insisting she awoke to an intruder standing over her, insisting she would never harm her children. But cross-examination pressed her on inconsistencies: the trajectory of the wounds, the lack of defensive injuries on her arms, the rarity of home invasion stabbings matching this pattern. Jurors listened in silence, weighing each word, each hesitation. When deliberations ended, the verdict came swiftly: guilty of capital murder for the death of her 5-year-old son. During sentencing, the prosecution emphasized the careful staging, the contradictions, and the forensic trail they said pointed only to her. The judge imposed the death penalty, placing her on Texas death row, where she continues to claim wrongful conviction. Outside the courthouse, supporters and critics clashed in emotional displays. Some carried signs demanding justice for the boys. Others insisted an innocent mother had been condemned. But inside the official record, the verdict stood a haunting, polarizing case etched permanently into Texas history. The Schenecker home stood in a quiet Tampa subdivision, the kind of place built on routine and discipline, an extension of the military life that had shaped the family for years. Neighbors often saw the teenage son heading to soccer practice and the daughter walking the family dog. Their father, an Army colonel, was frequently deployed overseas. Their mother, Julie, managed the home, driving the children to school, activities, and appointments. From the outside, they looked like a family held together by order and duty. Inside, however, something fragile had been cracking for months. According to family, friends, and medical records later cited in court, Julie's mental health had been deteriorating in troubling waves. Doctors had diagnosed her with severe bipolar disorder, and the roller coaster swings were growing sharper. Long nights without sleep, sudden bursts of agitation, and episodes of deep emotional collapse. Her husband tried to manage it between deployments, coordinating treatments, checking prescriptions, encouraging therapy. But distance became a barrier, and her condition worsened silently behind closed doors. In the week leading to the killings, her journals reflected a mind unraveling. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed by parenting tasks, feeling unappreciated, feeling lost. Entries referenced her frustration with the children's teenage behavior, scribbled in handwriting that investigators would later describe as increasingly erratic. By midweek, she drove to a gun store, an action that would later haunt a community, questioning how no one saw what was coming. Surveillance footage showed her appearing calm, polite, and focused as she purchased a handgun and ammunition, completing the process without hesitation. On the day of the murders, her husband was thousands of miles away on a military assignment. According to investigators, the morning unfolded with chilling precision. She waited in the driveway for her 16-year-old son to return from cross-country practice. As he entered the car, still wearing his school clothes, she attacked him at close range. Detectives later reconstructed what they called a controlled sequence of shots. She then drove home, walked upstairs, and entered her 13-year-old daughter's room. The girl was sitting at her computer. Julie attacked her in the same deliberate fashion. When police arrived, responding to a welfare check requested by her husband, who had been unable to reach anyone, they found Julie inside, dazed and unemotional. She was covered in residue and made statements so flat and casual that officers struggled to understand whether she grasped what had occurred. On the kitchen counter, investigators found a handwritten note. In neat, matter-of-fact language, she confessed to killing both children, citing their attitudes, their arguments, and her belief that they were ungrateful. The note, later read aloud in court, stunned even seasoned detectives. Her husband returned to a nightmare that defied comprehension. 2 children gone, and the family he worked to protect from afar, shattered in a single day. Outside the home, neighbors gathered in silence as police carried out evidence bags and sealed the property. Reporters spoke in muted tones. Teachers and classmates held impromptu vigils. No one could reconcile the mother they had seen at school events with the actions described in the police affidavit. In the days that followed, more details emerged about her prescriptions, her missed therapy sessions, the quiet collapse masked by routine. Yet for investigators, one truth was unavoidable. The killings were intentional, methodical, and irreversible. The courtroom filled with a heavy, unsettled silence as the trial began, one shaped not by mystery, but by the unbearable question of why a mother would turn against her own children. Prosecutors and defense attorneys agreed on the basic facts. Julie had attacked her 16-year-old son and 13-year-old daughter in a sequence investigators described as deliberate and controlled. Where they clashed was on the meaning behind those facts. Was this an act of calculated intent, or the catastrophic collapse of a mind overtaken by severe mental illness? The prosecution presented a methodical case. They began with the firearms expert who walked the jury through diagrams showing the exact firing angles and distances, emphasizing the consistency of each shot. They argued that the precision demonstrated planning, not chaos. Detectives testified that Julie purchased the handgun days in advance, fully aware of what she was doing. The chilling confession note found in her kitchen became a centerpiece of their narrative, not a rambling cry from someone in crisis, but a structured explanation filled with grievances directed at the children. According to prosecutors, it revealed motive, clarity, and emotional coldness. Then came the journals. Prosecutors displayed pages, written in sharp, pointed handwriting, filled with entries detailing irritations about teenage defiance and her belief that the children were disrespectful. They pointed to passages describing her frustrations with family life, arguing that these writings amounted to a motive shaped long before the killings. Several jurors took notes closely as these documents were read aloud, the words echoing through the room with disturbing detachment. The defense countered by calling psychiatrists who had treated her in the months before the incident. They described a woman battling severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features, someone who cycled between deep depression and manic agitation. One specialist testified that untreated episodes can distort reality to the point where judgment collapses entirely. They argued that her journals were not evidence of intent, but reflections of a mind at war with itself. They reminded the jury that she had been on multiple medications, some recently adjusted, and that her mental decline had been noted by medical professionals long before the tragedy. But prosecutors pressed back, questioning whether mental illness mitigated the level of control she displayed. They played the 911 call the husband made from overseas, his voice shaking as he begged officers to check on the children. They reminded jurors that Julie had waited for her son to return home before attacking him and had walked upstairs afterward with a steady, purposeful stride. In their view, her actions demonstrated comprehension and execution, not blackout hysteria. Throughout the proceedings, Julie sat motionless, often staring at the defense table rather than the witnesses. Observers noted she rarely reacted when photos of the children were shown or when their teachers described them as bright, kind, and full of life. Her lack of visible emotion became another point of debate, an artifact of illness or a sign of chilling detachment. When the jury began deliberations, the courtroom braced for a difficult decision. In the end, they rejected the insanity defense, concluding that despite her mental illness, the evidence supported intent. They found her guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. During sentencing, the judge spoke quietly but firmly, calling the case one of profound heartbreak. Julie received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered once more, this time not in fear, but in mourning. Candles flickered along the sidewalk, each flame a reminder of 2 young lives cut short and a family forever fractured by a tragedy no one could fully comprehend. Long before the night that shocked an entire nation, the warning signs had been there, bright, unmistakable, and ignored for years. Katherine Knight had been raised in a home where violence was as common as dinner, a place where threats and outbursts shaped her understanding of conflict. According to psychological reports introduced later in court, those early lessons stayed with her, turning into patterns she carried into adulthood. Partners described sudden mood changes, explosive temper, and a capacity for intimidation that went far beyond ordinary arguments. Some later admitted they had feared leaving her more than staying. Her relationships followed a predictable cycle. At first, she was warm, energetic, and attentive. Then came the volatility, sudden rages, threats, and a reputation for using physical intimidation to maintain control. Police were called multiple times over the years. Friends quietly urged her partners to be cautious. And yet, somehow, no one imagined how far the cycles would eventually go. Her children, too, witnessed the turbulence, growing up in an environment where tension simmered beneath the surface of daily life. By the time she met her final partner, a quiet and hard-working local man, the pattern was set. What he initially saw as strong personality soon revealed itself as something much more dangerous. Arguments escalated into frightening outbursts. Neighbors overheard shouting through the walls. Friends noticed his growing unease. He confided to some that he felt he was living beside a storm that never stopped forming. In the days before his death, he reportedly told co-workers he was terrified to go home. The evening of the killing was later reconstructed with meticulous care by investigators, who pieced together the sequence through forensic timing, witness accounts, and the condition of the home. It began quietly. She prepared the house, moved calmly through the rooms, and created an atmosphere that suggested routine rather than danger. According to detectives, nothing in the first hours signaled what was coming, but the tone changed after he fell asleep. Investigators believed she waited until he was fully unconscious before attacking him with a suddenness and intensity he never saw coming. The crime scene that police walked into the following morning left seasoned detectives struggling to process what they were seeing. While official reports kept certain details sealed, what emerged publicly painted a picture of extreme violence carried out with shocking deliberation. Officers found signs of a prolonged assault, evidence of planning, and actions that prosecutors later described as beyond comprehension. The forensic team, accustomed to confronting difficult scenes, reportedly stood frozen at the threshold before beginning their work. But perhaps most disturbing was what she attempted after the killing plans that pointed to a level of intent that prosecutors would later argue removed any possibility of this being a momentary loss of control. Food items laid out in the kitchen, notes prepared for family members, actions that investigators said revealed a mind following a script, not reacting in blind rage. Even veteran officers said they had never before encountered a crime so carefully arranged, yet so brutally executed. When her partner failed to arrive at work the next morning, colleagues alerted police. They had grown concerned after his recent comments about fear at home. Officers arrived at the house, knocked repeatedly, and received no answer. When they forced their way inside, the horrific scene confirmed their worst suspicions. Knight herself was found unconscious, having ingested a mixture of pills in what appeared to be an attempt to end her own life. Medics rushed her to a hospital, while detectives began the devastating task of documenting the room-by-room aftermath. As the forensic team worked, one thing became clear. Nothing about the scene aligned with spur-of-the-moment violence. It was organized, intentional, and meticulously carried out. And every detail pointed back to a woman who had been building toward this moment for years. When Katherine Knight entered the courtroom, every eye followed her. Reporters later wrote that she appeared calm, almost detached, as if the proceedings belonged to someone else entirely. Yet, the evidence laid before the court told a story so disturbing that prosecutors described it as the darkest case in the nation's modern criminal history. What happened inside that small suburban home was not only brutal, it was deliberate, planned, and carried out with a level of control that shocked even seasoned professionals. Prosecutors opened with the forensic team's testimony. They described how the crime scene had displayed a disturbing duality: explosive violence paired with chilling organization. Investigators testified that Knight had arranged items in the home after the killing in a way that suggested preparation rather than panic. They presented evidence showing she had taken her time, moving through the house with purpose. According to the lead detective, nothing about this scene looked like a moment of sudden loss. This was methodical. The prosecution leaned on her long-documented history, years of attacks on previous partners, threats, and patterns of escalating aggression. Witnesses described earlier episodes where she had injured others with knives, inflicted blows during arguments, or made violent threats when relationships became strained. In one chilling prior incident, introduced as evidence, she had hung photos of a previous partner's belongings on a clothesline after slashing them to pieces. This, prosecutors argued, was not a woman who snapped. It was someone who had been building towards something catastrophic for decades. Psychologists who evaluated her testified that she displayed traits consistent with severe personality disorders, including pathological jealousy and explosive rage. But they also emphasized her ability to maintain control when she wanted to. She was capable of organizing, planning, and carrying out tasks with precision. That combination, volatile violence, anchored by control, became central to the prosecution's argument. This was intent, not dissociation. The defense attempted to counter with claims that Knight had entered a dissociative state on the night of the killing. They argued that years of trauma, instability, and emotional turmoil culminated in a break from reality. They pointed to her ingestion of pills afterward as evidence of remorse or psychological collapse. But prosecutors responded that her actions before and after the killing, especially the chilling arrangements found in the kitchen, were incompatible with a dissociative episode. They presented her hospital statements, where she evaded direct responsibility and offered fragmented explanations. The inconsistencies, they said, were not signs of confusion, they were signs of manipulation. The jury listened carefully, as investigators outlined each step of the timeline. They heard about the warnings her partner had shared with friends in the days before his death. They heard about her pattern of isolating partners and escalating violence. They heard about the final hours of the victim's life, reconstructed through forensic evidence with precision. And they heard about Knight's lack of genuine remorse in the aftermath. In the sentencing phase, the judge delivered remarks that would become part of Australian legal history. He noted the extreme brutality, the measured planning, and the profound danger Knight posed to anyone around her. He stated that her crimes were so grievous, so disturbing, that conventional sentencing cannot apply. He concluded that she should never again be allowed to live outside a secure facility. Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australia to receive a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A ruling the judge marked with the rare phrase, "never to be released." Outside the courthouse, the community gathered in stunned silence. People placed flowers at a local memorial garden. Some brought letters for the victim's family, expressing sorrow and disbelief. Even those who had followed the case closely struggled to understand how someone who once raised children, attended barbecues, and worked at a factory could cross the line into something so monstrously premeditated. But inside the record of the court, the answer was clear. Years of escalating violence had collided with lethal intent, forming a case that would remain etched in Australian memory for decades. The gravel road wound through empty fields and bare winter trees, the kind of rural stretch where headlights vanish into darkness and no one hears a cry for help. According to investigators, that isolation was exactly what Michelle Kehoe wanted when she loaded her 2 young sons into the family minivan and drove them deep into the Iowa countryside. Friends later said she seemed quiet that week, distracted, drained, and retreating into herself. But no one imagined the direction her thoughts were taking or the tragedy that would unfold in the cold pre-dawn hours. Her plan began with a soft, deceptive calm. She told the boys they were going for a drive, something she had done before when she needed to clear her mind. The oldest son, just 8 years old, later told detectives that nothing felt unusual at first. They listened to music. She spoke gently. The younger child dozed off in his seat. But as the road narrowed and the farms thinned out, detectives believed she made her decision. She pulled onto a remote gravel path near the edge of a wooded area and turned off the engine. Darkness swallowed the vehicle in an instant. What happened next was pieced together from forensic evidence and the older boys' later, heartbreaking testimony. She attacked them with quiet, devastating efficiency. The younger son suffered injuries so severe that first responders could do nothing to save him. The older child, wounded but conscious, recalled trying to shield his brother. In a voice that officers described as steady beyond his years, he later recounted the moment he realized his mother was the one hurting them. Not a stranger, not an intruder, but the person they trusted most in the world. After the attack, investigators said she attempted to stage the scene as an abduction and suicide attempt. She inflicted wounds upon herself, created signs of a struggle, and left the boys in the cold. The older child, fighting through pain and shock, somehow managed to escape the vehicle. He walked barefoot through darkness until he reached a nearby home, where he collapsed on the porch and begged for help. The homeowners called for emergency responders, and his words to the first officer were soft, trembling, and unforgettable. "Mum hurt us." While medics rushed him to the hospital, deputies headed toward the remote road he described. They found the minivan sitting under a thin layer of frost, doors open, the younger child inside. Inside the vehicle was a handwritten note, a rambling message claiming she and the boys had been abducted and left to die. Investigators immediately noticed inconsistencies. The wording felt rehearsed. The explanations contradicted physical evidence, and the injuries she inflicted on herself, while visible, appeared strategically placed, not the result of a violent struggle. At the hospital, the older son's account became the turning point. Despite his pain, he described the drive, the sudden attack, and the moment he realized she was lying when she spoke of danger outside the vehicle. Detectives recorded his statement, and it became one of the most emotionally powerful pieces of the case. According to officers, he never raised his voice. He simply told them what happened, asking only once where his little brother was and whether he would be all right. When deputies confronted Kehoe at the hospital, her story began to unravel. She repeated claims of being attacked by a stranger, but her tone lacked fear or urgency. Blood pattern analysis from the minivan contradicted her timeline entirely. Her own wounds did not match the account she offered, and the note found in the car, its careful phrasing, its steady handwriting did not reflect the chaos she described. By the time investigators completed their reconstruction, one conclusion stood above all others. The abduction was staged, the note fabricated, and the attack planned. Her surviving son had emerged as both victim and witness, a child who saw more than any young mind should ever have to bear. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors began outlining their case, a sequence built not on speculation, but on the careful, methodical dismantling of every detail Michelle Kehoe had constructed on that cold November morning. The handwritten note found in the minivan became the anchor of their narrative. Placed neatly beside the children, it described a shadowy abductor, a violent struggle, and a desperate attempt to save her sons. But handwriting analysts, called in early during the investigation, testified that the letter bore none of the pressure variations, smudging, or trembling expected from someone writing in panic. Instead, they said, it was composed in a calm, deliberate hand. The wording also raised red flags. Experts pointed out that phrases meant to create urgency were oddly polished, almost rehearsed. Prosecutors argued that the note was not the frantic product of a terrified mother, but the calculated work of someone staging a crime scene. As they displayed enlarged sections of the writing on a screen for the jury, the contrast between the narrative she tried to create and the evidence presented became increasingly stark. Then came the forensic reconstruction. Investigators described how the blood patterns inside the van contradicted her abduction story entirely. The lack of defensive marks on the vehicle door frames, the absence of footprints in the gravel outside, and the positions of the children revealed a planned attack, not an ambush. One detective testified that every element of the scene pointed inward, not outward, meaning nothing supported the presence of an unknown assailant. But the most powerful testimony came from the surviving child. Now physically recovered but still carrying the emotional weight of the night, he entered the courtroom with a quiet bravery that moved observers to tears. Speaking softly, he described waking in the dark, hearing his younger brother cry out, and realizing the person hurting them was their mother. According to court transcripts, he never raised his voice, never embellished, he simply told the truth with heartbreaking clarity. His words dismantled any remaining doubt and left the jury visibly shaken. The defense argued that Kehoe suffered from severe depression and a psychological collapse, claiming she had acted in a dissociative state. A psychiatrist testified that she had a long history of emotional struggles and that her suicide attempt afterward reflected overwhelming despair. But prosecutors countered that her actions were too organized, too sequential, too controlled for dissociation. They pointed to her purchase of supplies days earlier, the remote location chosen for the attack, and the structured tone of the fabricated letter. In their view, the preparation contradicted any claim of an impulsive break. To reinforce their narrative, they introduced portions of Kehoe's earlier medical records and counseling notes, which showed signs of emotional turmoil but no indication of psychosis. They argued that her actions stemmed not from an altered state, but from intention shaped by unresolved distress. And the surviving boy's testimony, the raw, unfiltered account of a child who had faced unthinkable betrayal, became the emotional core of the prosecution's case. When the jury withdrew for deliberation, there was little doubt about the outcome. They returned with a swift verdict: guilty of first-degree murder for the younger son's death, and guilty of attempted murder for the attack on the older child. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged the tragedy of mental illness, but underscored the calculated nature of the crime. He imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. As court recessed, many remained seated, absorbing the weight of the case. Some wept quietly. Others clasped their children's hands. Outside, a small memorial formed for the younger boy, flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes from classmates who remembered his laughter. And the surviving son, now a symbol of resilience, became the voice that preserved truth in the face of a mother's deception. By the time authorities finally unraveled the truth about the Knorr family, the story sounded like something no one wanted to believe. Behind the doors of a modest Sacramento apartment, Theresa Knorr had created a world ruled by paranoia, manipulation, and absolute control. According to prosecutors, she used fear as currency and domination as routine, molding her children into extensions of her will. Former neighbors would later say they sensed tension in the household, but none understood how far the terror went or how long it had been building. Theresa's behavior followed a disturbing pattern described by mental health experts as narcissistic domination. She isolated her children from outsiders, monitored their conversations, and controlled their movements with strict, unpredictable rules. Disobedience was met with punishments that escalated steadily over the years. According to statements later given by her surviving children, she could shift from calm to furious within seconds. The home became a place where each child learned to stay silent anticipate her moods, and hope the spotlight of her anger landed elsewhere. The tension sharpened when she began focusing on her daughters, especially the older ones, whom she accused of disrespect, betrayal, or imagined conspiracies. Investigators revealed that one of the girls became the target of escalating punishments after Theresa convinced herself that her daughter had caused her physical ailments. The accusations were baseless, but they sparked episodes that frightened even her son's teenagers, conditioned to obey but silently horrified by what they witnessed. The first death occurred under circumstances that shocked detectives when they pieced the story together. After an attack that left her daughter gravely injured, Theresa refused medical treatment, insisting that hospitals could not be trusted and that intervention would expose the family to authorities. Over the next days, the girl's condition worsened. Her siblings pleaded quietly for help, but Theresa shut down every attempt. Eventually, the daughter died inside the home, with no doctor, no rescue, and no one allowed to speak her name afterward. According to later testimony, the children were forced into silence, ordered to act as if nothing had happened. The second death occurred months later and under even more troubling circumstances. Theresa's paranoia deepened. She believed another daughter was plotting against her, influenced by outsiders, possibly even law enforcement. The accusations grew louder, more erratic, and more frightening. Punishments escalated again. According to witness statements, the girl endured long periods of confinement, deprivation, and emotional torment. When Theresa decided she could no longer control her, she drove the children across the Nevada border under the guise of a family trip. It was there, in an isolated area off a rural highway, that the second daughter lost her life. Detectives later said the details were so disturbing they struggled to keep emotion out of their reports. But the children's testimonies, that quiet, halting recounting of what happened, became the backbone of the case. They spoke about fear so deep, it shaped every choice, every breath. They described Theresa's ability to manipulate them until they felt they had no choice but to obey her orders, even when those orders crossed unimaginable lines. For years after the deaths, the family remained locked in silence. Theresa threatened them, controlled them, and convinced them that authorities would blame them all if the truth ever came out. They lived under the weight of secrets that became too heavy to carry. But as the children grew older and moved away, distance brought clarity. One day, the wall of silence finally cracked. A tip reached detectives. Then another. Within months, investigators opened an inquiry that would expose a pattern of cruelty stretching back decades. What began as a whisper from a surviving child soon became a full criminal investigation poised to bring Theresa Knorr's long reign of fear to an end. When the first surviving child finally stepped into a police station years after the crimes, detectives later said it felt less like an interview and more like the opening of a vault, one sealed by fear, threats, and years of psychological domination. The confession was quiet, trembling, but devastatingly clear. And once that door opened, the rest of the family began to speak, their voices carrying the weight of everything Theresa Knorr had spent years forcing them to hide. Investigators listened as the son described in painful detail how his mother manipulated him into becoming part of the violence. According to his statement, Theresa wielded guilt, fear, and relentless psychological pressure to bend the children to her will. She convinced them that helping her was the only way to protect the family from outsiders. Detectives would later describe his testimony as the words of a child who spent his life trapped in someone else's nightmare. His account provided timelines, locations, and descriptions that matched elements of earlier tips, giving investigators the roadmap they needed. Another sibling soon came forward, corroborating the first story almost point by point. Their voices, soft, halting, and burdened by years of guilt, became the backbone of the state's case. They described how Theresa orchestrated each event with chilling precision, isolating her daughters, escalating punishments, and ultimately directing their final moments. They spoke of their own involvement not with excuses, but with profound remorse, telling detectives they lived every day haunted by the memory of what they had been coerced to do. Prosecutors began assembling a narrative that stretched across 2 states and multiple years. Forensic analysis of remains located in Nevada confirmed trauma consistent with the siblings' accounts. Investigators pieced together burned clothing, discarded items, and statements from witnesses who remembered seeing the Knorr family traveling through rural areas around the time of the killings. Slowly, a mosaic of cruelty emerged, one shaped not by sudden violence, but by long-term domination and terror. When the case reached court, the sons took the stand. Their testimonies, delivered through tears, forced the courtroom to confront the full scope of the household's terror. They described Theresa's shifting moods, her accusations, her threats to kill any child who disobeyed her. They explained how she forbade them from seeking help, convincing them police would blame them all. They recounted the nights the daughters cried in fear, the days spent trying to stay invisible, the moments when silence felt like the only form of survival left to them. Prosecutors argued that Theresa's actions were part of a long-standing pattern, cruelty rooted in paranoia, control, and a desire for absolute dominance. They presented psychological evaluations characterizing her as deeply manipulative, capable of calculated violence, and unable to accept responsibility. They argued that the daughters' deaths were not accidents, not moments of emotional collapse, but the predictable result of escalating abuse. The defense attempted to introduce evidence of Theresa's own traumatic upbringing, suggesting that years of instability shaped her into someone unable to regulate her emotions. But prosecutors countered sharply, emphasizing the level of planning, the threats she used to silence her children, and the consistency of the siblings' testimonies. They argued that this was not a case of a mother losing control. It was a mother exerting it with terrifying intensity. Faced with overwhelming testimony, forensic evidence, and mounting corroboration, Theresa Knorr accepted a plea deal rather than face a capital trial. She pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including the killings of her 2 daughters. The judge sentenced her to 2 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole for decades. As she was led from the courtroom, none of her surviving children spoke to her. Their silence wasn't anger, it was the profound, exhausted quiet of people who had finally laid down a burden they carried for most of their lives. Outside, reporters described the case as one of the most haunting in California's history. A story not only of unimaginable cruelty, but of children who survived long enough to tell the truth. The boy's body was found near a Miami Beach apartment complex, small, bruised, and heartbreakingly alone. His clothes were torn, his hair matted, and his frame so thin that one detective later said he looked as if life had been draining out of him for a long time. No one knew his name. No one stepped forward to claim him. And in those first hours, officers only knew him by the lollipop patterned shirt he was wearing. It was the detail that would follow the case for decades, giving him a name the world would never forget. Baby Lollipops. Investigators worked against a clock that felt merciless. An unidentified child meant no family to interview, no school to contact, no medical records to examine. Detectives turned to the public, releasing the boy's likeness and clothing in hopes someone recognized him. The community responded with a wave of grief and outrage. Tips flooded hotlines, some credible, others desperate guesses. Across the country, missing child reports were cross-referenced, photographs reviewed, and families contacted. But no match came. The child remained a mystery, silent, fragile, and nameless. Forensic teams began reconstructing what had happened. Medical examiners documented extensive injuries, many in different stages of healing, suggesting long-term mistreatment rather than a single moment of violence. The boy's weight was significantly under what a child his age should have been. Detectives noted scars, fractures, and signs of malnourishment. One examiner later described it as a map of suffering, each mark telling part of a story no one had yet heard. Days passed before a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A social services worker recognized the child from a previous welfare check. She contacted police, describing a toddler who resembled the boy they'd found, living in a home marked by instability and volatile arguments. That lead pointed detectives toward a mother known alternately as Anna Maria Cardona or Michelle Notaro, depending on which name she used at the time. She had moved frequently, leaving behind neighbors who reported shouting, crying, and troubling scenes that now, in hindsight, looked like warnings. Detectives tracked her to a new apartment. When questioned, she appeared detached, offering shifting explanations and insisting she had given the child to a friend months earlier. But her statements quickly unraveled. She contradicted herself repeatedly, and her demeanor flat, indifferent, almost rehearsed troubled investigators. Meanwhile, neighbors' testimonies began to pile up. Some recalled seeing her berate the toddler in public. Others described hearing cries through thin apartment walls, cries that didn't sound like normal childhood tantrums, as one witness put it. As police searched her residence, they found objects linked to prolonged mistreatment and evidence of a child living in severe neglect. The timeline grew clearer. Far from being abandoned to a stranger or lost in the system, the boy's final days pointed back to the home he shared with his mother. Detectives believed she had been hiding the child, limiting contact with outsiders, and maintaining a facade of normalcy, while abuse continued behind closed doors. The investigation widened to include interviews with anyone who had crossed her path: former friends, acquaintances, even her own relatives. Many described a woman overwhelmed by anger, resentment, and stress. Some recalled her referring to the boy as a burden. Others said she isolated him from her other children. A neighbor tearfully told detectives she wished she had done more. "There were signs," she said. "We all saw pieces of something wrong." With DNA confirmation, welfare records, and witness accounts aligned, the identity of baby Lollipops was finally established. And with that, the investigation turned fully toward one person, the boy's mother, who now stood at the center of one of the most emotionally wrenching child abuse cases in Florida's history. Everything was closing in. Forensic findings, witness recollections, her shifting stories, and the growing realization that the truth was even darker than anyone imagined. The trial opened under a national spotlight, with reporters crowding every available seat and satellite trucks lined across the courthouse lawn. The image of the unidentified toddler, now known to be the son of Michelle Notaro, had already captured public outrage. By the time proceedings began, the community was demanding answers, justice, and some explanation for how such prolonged suffering could have gone unnoticed for so long. Prosecutors approached the case with a gravity that reflected the magnitude of the tragedy. They began with the medical examiner's testimony. In clear, steady language, the examiner described the child's injuries marks in different stages of healing, fractures that had gone untreated, and signs consistent with extended malnourishment. While keeping the description within legal and ethical boundaries, the testimony made clear that the abuse did not happen in a single outburst. It was chronic, escalating, and visible in the very structure of the child's bones. One juror later said the room felt frozen, every word chiseling away at the defense's attempts to distance Notaro from the acts. Next came the forensic pathologists, who reconstructed the timeline leading up to the child's death. They explained how certain injuries could only have occurred through repeated harm and described patterns showing that the child had been deprived of food, medical attention, and basic care. Their expertise countered any narrative suggesting the boy's condition had developed suddenly or outside the mother's knowledge. According to their analysis, the mistreatment spanned months, The prosecution also presented testimony from neighbors and acquaintances, people who had seen glimpses of the child's deteriorating condition, heard disturbing sounds through walls, or noticed periods when the boy seemed to vanish entirely from sight. Some spoke through tears as they recalled moments they had questioned but never acted upon, moments they now believed might have changed the child's fate. Their statements highlighted a pattern of isolation and concealment, adding emotional weight to the forensic evidence. Central to the prosecution's case was the role of Notaro's boyfriend, who they argued participated in the abuse. But they emphasized that Notaro, as the child's mother, held the ultimate responsibility to protect him. They presented statements in which she blamed others, offered inconsistent timelines, and shifted her story depending on the audience. To prosecutors, this pattern signaled not confusion but deception. In closing arguments, the state described the boy's final months as a slow extinguishing of a child's life, shaped by cruelty, neglect, and deliberate concealment. The jury deliberated with visible anguish. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. They found Michelle Notaro guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. The judge, reflecting the severity of the case, imposed the death penalty. The decision triggered intense public reaction. Some felt it was justice. Others argued the case reflected deep failures in the social welfare system that should have intervened earlier. For years, the baby Lollipops case remained a flashpoint in discussions about child protection, mandatory reporting, and criminal sentencing. But the story did not end there. Years later, Notaro received a retrial after appeals raised procedural concerns about her original defense. During the new proceedings, additional psychological and contextual evidence was introduced, and the jury ultimately recommended a different outcome. Her sentence was reduced from death to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The shift in sentencing reignited debate across Florida. Some felt the reduction was a miscarriage of justice. Others argued it reflected a more complete understanding of the case. What remained unchanged was the public's enduring heartbreak. The knowledge that a little boy had suffered in silence, unnoticed by the systems meant to protect him. Outside the courthouse, a small memorial featuring lollipops, toys, and candles continued to grow even years after the verdict. Strangers who never knew the child left messages of apology, grief, and remembrance. And the case, now etched into Florida's legal history, stood as one of the most haunting reminders of what can happen when a mother's responsibility collapses into something unimaginably dark. The afternoon began like so many tense days inside the Sheats household, arguments simmering beneath the surface, marital strain building in waves, and a mother whose emotional state had reportedly grown more volatile over the years. Friends later told investigators that Christy Sheats worried constantly about losing control over her family, especially her daughters as they grew older and began asserting their independence. According to police reports and statements collected from relatives, long-standing marital tensions had intensified in the months leading up to the tragedy, creating an environment where fear and frustration circulated through the home like a silent storm. On the day of the shooting, the family's arguments escalated quickly. Police would later say they received a 911 call, reporting a domestic disturbance at the Sheats residence. The call ended abruptly. When officers rushed toward the address, they had no idea they were about to walk into one of the most shocking family homicides in recent Texas memory. Neighbors later told investigators they heard shouting, then a sudden, explosive shift, screams that sent them running to windows and doorways. What they saw was a scene that witnesses described as horrifying and surreal. According to official reports, Christy Sheats had retrieved a handgun from inside the home during the argument. Investigators concluded that she pursued her daughters from the house out onto the quiet suburban street, a place lined with trimmed lawns, parked cars, and families preparing dinner. It was there, in full view of neighbors, that she shot her 19-year-old daughter. The younger daughter, 17, pleaded for help. Witnesses later reported hearing her begging for her life as she tried to run, But Christy fired again, striking her as she attempted to flee. The father, Jason Sheats, fled into the street, shouting for Christy to stop. According to his later statements to police, officers noted that he appeared traumatized, telling them repeatedly that he had tried to shield their daughters but could not reach them in time. His account, corroborated by multiple eyewitnesses, painted a picture of chaos and desperation. The girls seeking safety, their father trying to intervene, and Christy standing in the road with the handgun still raised. When law enforcement arrived, they issued commands for her to drop the weapon. According to the sheriff's report, Christy refused, pointing the firearm toward officers. They opened fire, killing her at the scene. The daughters were rushed to medical teams, but neither survived their injuries. For the officers, neighbors, and medical responders, the scene left a lasting emotional impact, one of those cases that veteran investigators later described as impossible to forget. In the days that followed, police interviews revealed more context. Jason told investigators that Christy had struggled with her mental health for years, experiencing periods of instability and episodes of intense anger. According to his statements, she had previously made alarming comments during marital arguments. Records showed she had owned the handgun legally, though relatives said she had experienced difficulty managing her emotions and had at times been advised not to have access to firearms. Police noted that earlier calls to the residence had hinted at a troubled dynamic that never crossed the threshold into direct criminal allegations until the day it exploded into violence. Public reaction was immediate and anguished. The image of two young sisters losing their lives on a suburban street stunned the community. Candlelight vigils lined the sidewalks, and classmates spoke through tears about their kindness, intelligence, and dreams for the future. Many asked the same haunting questions. What warning signs were missed? Could intervention have changed the outcome? And how did a family argument escalate into one of the most devastating mother-perpetrated shootings in recent history? Investigators later concluded that the shootings were intentional and driven by emotional turmoil rooted in marital conflict and parental control issues. They emphasized that the daughters were unarmed, that the father's accounts aligned with witness testimonies, and that Christy's refusal to drop the weapon forced the officer's fatal response. With no surviving perpetrator, the case closed on a narrative pieced together from sworn statements, forensic mapping, and the voices of those who saw the tragedy unfold in real time. What remained was a profound sense of loss, a family shattered, a community traumatized, and two young women whose futures were cut short in a moment of senseless, irreversible violence.